It had been a long, tiring day at work. It was quiet as I waited alone for the train. It was a bit after midnight, and so dark that I could only see the square foot around me that the small light illuminated. Fortunately, I wasn't stuck waiting long for the train. Eagerly, I ran in the second the doors opened. There were only 2 other men in the compartment, not unusual for this time of night. The place reeked of smoke from the older man huffing on a cigarette. He took another long drag of it and watched me as I came in and took my seat. I sat and looked up at the other man sitting across from the smoker. He was only about 5 seats away, but his face was hidden by his hood, so I had trouble making out his features. His eyes, though, oh, I could see those clearly. One was normal, but the other was red, where it should be white. He stared shamelessly back at me, with a tight, almost pained expression. I smiled at him, trying to break the tension, but he just stared. I looked out the window, trying to ignore his gaze, but I could still feel his eyes on me. The train lights began to flicker and went out for a moment.
"Sorry folks,"
said a voice over the static of the PA.
"we're going to get a maintenance on that in the morning. We apologise for any inconvenience."
My stomach dropped, and I struggled to control my breathing. I reminded myself that there was no reason to be afraid of the dark, that I was a grown man, a tax-paying adult who... Oh, thank God. The lights were back. I hadn't even realised my eyes were squeezed shut. Sighing, I opened them to see the man's unsettling eye staring directly into mine, from only 2 seats away. Bewildered, I looked over at the older man, who hadn't moved from his seat. He took another drag from his cigarette and coughed, acting like nothing had happened. The train rumbled down the tracks. I was afraid to look back at the red-eyed man. I didn't want to. I didn't want to move, or even breathe. I tried to convince myself that the whole thing was in my mind. Maybe I was just tired from a long day of work. Maybe I was just paranoid, and he wasn't even looking at me. The lights flickered again, and went out. I held my breath, waiting for the lights to come back. After a moment, they did, and he was in the seat next to me, his face only a few inches away from mine. I leaned back. "What the hell, mate? What do you think you're doing?" He didn't respond. Instead, the smoker angrily said, "Look, kid, if you wanted me to put out the cigarette, you just had to ask nice, okay? Not you, this arsehole over here." The smoker stared at me for a second, confused. "It's just me and you here. Kid, you alright?" The red-eyed man hadn't moved or responded at all. The lights went out again.
You know, I once heard a saying, sometimes you never really care about something important until it's gone, until it's been taken from you in an instant, before you can react. And when it happens, that's it. You can't change it back to how it was. You can't make up for it. You can't do anything. I came from an engineering works in Cumberland, Fletcher, Jennings & Co. I think it was called. Can't really remember anymore. What I do remember is that I wasn't completed properly. What I mean is, my construction was rushed, though I didn't really knew it, not yet anyway. This place, the Mid-Sodal Railway, was desperate for an engine. When they knew about me, they wanted me here as quickly as possible. That's exactly what happened. I remember how excited I was after being stuck in a workshop for God knows how long. I was out in the world. I felt free and that nothing, not a single thing could stop me. I think it took about a day to get me from the works to the transfer yard of the railway. I didn't care. I enjoyed watching the scenery as it flew by. All the same though, it was wonderful when the journey ended and I was finally on rails again, under my own power. The other mid-soda engine was there to greet me. He said his name was Duke, and I introduced myself afterwards. He seemed very pleased to see me, and we chatted for a while, as I was being fired up. He said he was the first on the line, and had mostly ran it single-handedly. There were other engines, but they were either visitors or sent away for being troublemakers. I began to feel a little nervous after hearing that. I could tell through Duke's tone that he was doubting me, that I would just be like the others. It meant I would have to make a very good impression, something I was unsure I could do. I had hoped my introduction to working wouldn't be this stressful. Regardless, once I had the fire, I got to work. Surprisingly, the beginning was smooth. I did simple duties at first, shunt coaches and trucks, take workmen to the mines, help with maintenance and so on. Duke began to be a little easier on me over time, as he was impressed with my work. Then things got a little more interesting. I was tasked with my very first passenger train. It was double-headed with Duke, so he could help me if I slipped up somewhere. I did a few times, but nothing too serious. After that, I was trusted to handle important trains alone. Me and Duke began to grow fond of each other. I actually had a nickname for him, Dukey. I'm not sure he entirely liked it, saying it wouldn't suit his grace, or something like that, but he didn't seem to mind too much. After that, I felt on top of the world. I had a great home, with plenty of work, and a friend to share it with. It seemed impossible for anything to go wrong. But something did go wrong. My crew had noticed a pattern during my runs. I was a very rough rider, making it difficult for them to keep their balance in my cab. One day, the manager and some workmen gave me an examination to find the cause of the problem and hopefully a solution. That's when I noticed it, that my construction was poorly done. Some of my parts were loose and others were unstable. Unfortunately, the railway didn't have the resources to fix me, nor did they have the time to send me to a workshop that did. Summer was approaching, and it would be then that the work would be at its largest. There was no way Duke could manage it alone, not at his current age anyway. The manager concluded that my crew would have to put up with the rough riding until they could find time to get it fixed. My nerves had returned. Everything was fine. Everything was perfect, except this one issue that could put my whole life at risk. But I told myself that it wouldn't, that I will still be the best I can be, that this will not affect me. Little did I realise, my real troubles hadn't even started yet. The first time was a week after the examination. I was making my way to the mines with some empties. The trucks were behaving well, and my crew had gotten used to handling me. Then, as I approached a small curve, I just came off. I just went off the tracks and landed on the ballast. It happened so suddenly, there was no time for anyone to react. Some workmen came to re-rail me, and Duke demanded to know what had happened. I told him I didn't know, until the driver suggested it was my condition that caused it. Duke, in a stern manner, told me I should be more careful, and that if I didn't and not go so fast. That way, this wouldn't happen again. That's exactly what I did, and the next few days went by smoothly. I was much slower than usual, and I didn't derail once. However, this all created another problem. All my trains were late, resulting in many complaints from passengers and workmen. I started to get frustrated with Duke after that. His advice only made matters worse for me, so I scrapped the idea of being slow. I would go at the speed required for the job. The accidents became more common after that. They were quick and unpredictable. They could happen when I was pulling a train, or doing something as simple as shunting a few trucks. Each time I became more angry and careless, and each time Duke would scold me as if it was my fault. I thought to myself, what's wrong with him? Why is he getting so worked up over some derailments? Who worries about a few spills? Well, they did here, and truthfully, my spills were more than just a few. Yet, despite all this, the manager kept me around, knowing what the cause of all this was, and knowing it wouldn't be long now. Soon I could go to the works, and my troubles would be over. And my troubles were over, but not in the way we all expected. I was up at one of the mines with some loaded trucks. The miners loaded them sooner than expected, meaning I could actually take my time on this run. But even that couldn't help me. As I began to leave, some workers were by the line having their backs turned to the track while having a chat. I gave them a quick whistle. They were at a safe distance, but I saw no harm in letting them know I was coming. They looked over, waved a thank you, and turned back. As I was about to pass them, it happened. Just like every other time, I leapt off the track and moved towards the workers. As one of them turned to me, my buffer beam knocked into him. I didn't run him over, I had stopped by then, but he fell head first into the hard ground. When his friends helped him up, I saw he had a bleeding nose and scratches all over his face. He was furious and shouted and swore, saying I was a hazard that belongs nowhere but a scrapyard. Soon, Duke arrived and took me to the sheds. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. There was nothing to say. At the sheds, the manager told me that while I wasn't to blame for the incident, because of it, a majority of the railway staff didn't trust me anymore. I didn't respond much. All I could do was sit there, disgraced and depressed, as the place I once called home became unrecognizable. I was then informed that there was only one alternative to scrap, one way to make me useful at last. By the time I found out what I would become, it was too late. My wheels were removed, and I was placed in a small open building behind the shed. They had turned me into a generator. All I could do now is watch. Watch as other trains passed me. Watch as the railway changed through the years. And I would never be part of it again. Apparently, Duke told other engines about me, as a warning of what can happen if they act out of line. I suppose it is the best way to keep them in order. When passing, some of those engines would whistle hello, while others ignored me, as if I was nothing. In some ways, I guess I was. Then one day, I heard the big news. The Mid-Sodo Railway had run out of business and was closing down. People from other railways came to buy the engines. No one ever considered purchasing me and restoring me back to an engine. But why bother when you already have a set of younger engines right there and then for the taking? After all that, the railway was completely abandoned. No one was around, except me. Time went by, and the world around me began to change. Heavy rain started to fall, thunder could be heard above. I didn't think much about it, though. I couldn't really think about anything. What was there to think about? As I began to try and think of anything to think about, I didn't notice a few rocks falling from the mountain above, landing near me. I didn't notice the sound of land above me weakening from the rain. And I didn't notice the large rock that was to fall directly above me. And now, here I am, looking at where my remains still are, buried under rubble. All I can do now is roam this place as a lonely spectre. Someone who thought he was unstoppable, and yet everything that is so important to any engine was taken from him. Someone who can no longer feel. I don't feel happy, or sad, or angry. I don't feel anything. Blasted rain. Never heard anything like it. Still here, I see. Still in my shed, on my old little home, or what's left of it. How long have I been asleep? Doesn't matter, I suppose. I should be able to get back to it soon. I wonder how Falcon and Stuart are doing. Hopefully they found a home they like. I wonder if they still remember me. If they told anyone about me. I wonder... Oh, I almost forgot about him. I wonder what happened to Smudger. Did anyone buy him? I don't remember anyone mentioning him when those controllers were here. Was he left behind?
Murky, silent brushings of turquoise stripes flowed all over and among one another, smoothing the still rocks and plants of the sea floor into each other, until they became one of the everlasting ocean. Sand upon the bottom extending beyond one's sight into a distortment of greenish blue, burying every sunken object from the land above the rippling surface water. Partially submerged in this blatant rush of little tan rocks, stood a rusted metal figment from the upper world's making, at such an angle as to almost gaze up at the blurred home she once kept as her own. Still having a soul trapped within her ruined frames, she often thought of those days when her broken wheels whirred all day, while steam billowed from her funnel into a cool summer breeze. A breeze which was never to be felt again. The frigid, dimly lit ocean floor and slight hues of the shore only centimetres away from the water's top were all that was left to tell her soul she was still alive. Rotting away at the bottom of the ocean near to the dock, she slid off 5 years before after a frantic and scarring runaway that led to her final resting place. Never before had the craving for the flames of death been as clear as they were now. There was nothing else she desired to have more than to leave the world of dull months after dull years of uselessness and start anew in a different frame, ready to experience so much more than observing the slate-coloured fish that gave off so many reminders of the home and locomotives she missed so dearly. She had lost a majority of her shape and details due to weathering from the salt-filled waters filling up her boiler, causing many large holes to cover her remains, all of which were bordered with rust. The only spot unrusted was an algae-covered nameplate, faintly engraved to read "More Alive" beneath, which was ever so slightly visible. Her once youthful face had been dissolved into nothing by the extensive pressure of water after she drowned, leaving her no way to cry aloud or shed a tear. She did so extensively low within her mind, so that her figurative tears would have raised the water even more. It may have risen even without her tears, as a striking scatter of red came flying out from the edge of the pier like a bullet slicing the water above. The little sunken engine gazed hopingly to the surface as a large crimson diesel engine tipped partially into the water, eyes filled with shock and pain as they stared deeply at the rusty remains laying on the ocean floor in panic, before an outer force pulled him back onto solid tracks from behind. This occurrence ended as soon as it started, and gave Morelief something new to think about. She did know of diesels, the revolutionary new technology that had only just began taking over before she was pulled beneath the waves. The tank engine had kept a strong grudge against them ever since then, figuring they were why she was left on the seabed in the first place. But she couldn't help but empathize with the pain of one's face being forced under, knowing he would certainly drown, just as she had. So seeing one now after 5 years have the same thing happen, yet survive to tell the tale, was relieving in a way, as she hadn't made contact with anything besides the silver fish up until then. Though Morelief found his shape quite unfamiliar and obscure, she found that she recognized his eyes as not being those of a stranger. After being rescued, the diesel, whose name was Sinyad, also thought of the engine he saw beneath the waves. At first, he thought of her as being merely a mirage, considering his sights wasn't thought of as quite top-notch, and went on with his day, trying to convince himself that a fate of that sort was too horrid to be real. He found himself observing his sharp, definite surroundings between journeys and came across a thought. He had always been told of his eyesight was poor, and yet could see the world as clearly as crystal despite his half-closed right eye. So he figured that if there was even a chance that he saw a drowned engine trapped beneath the water, he'd check. What was to be done with an engine of her state was another matter. Restoring her to her previous state would be of no use, with her communication being non-existent, and usefulness in this land of no steam engines would have her in danger of scrap, even if she were saved. There was only one way to put her out of pain and let her live a functional, joy-filled life. He didn't like it much, but he knew it was the only way. He set off for the harbour that night. The black and roomy look of the bay always left much to be desired from the delicate corpse of Moralaev, who thought of nothing but the end of her existence, just as she did most every evening before. This night, though, something was different. A slight beam of light pierced through the depths, shining directly upon her along with a hint of red tone to it. She didn't think much of it until a slight shimmering of metal bars came sinking to the sand surrounding her and pressed horizontal beams all around and slightly under her frames. The metal was attached to a contraption above the surface by a series of thick chains, and after a moment of realization, she figured out what it was. A crane. The half-dead Moralaev was being lifted, the sand caked along her side, loosening its grip as she rose from the ground, leaving only little bits of her wheels buried in the sand below. Ripples lengthened out as Moralaev emerged from the sea, as if she was coming back to life. She soared through the chilling frozen air, taking in the bright lights and the peaceful snow falling from the sky. A shot of pain came through her as the weight of the world finally shot down on her after the weightless water world left her body. Being manoeuvred slowly through the air brought shaking breezes through her frail, broken figure as she was placed on a flatbed with as much care as could be brought by the crane, considering the temperature. Directly in front of her was the same red diesel with those eyes she could just barely remember. "Dinna worry," he said kindly, before giving a breath of preparation. "You'll be able to rest now." His words were rather soothing, kind, and smooth through his Scottish accent, which she missed hearing so much from the mouths of others. The words he uttered, however, had struck her like a gong. She knew she'd heard those words before, but couldn't quite get where. She looked through the yards she once knew so well, now vacant of all coal hoppers and every last water tower. They were also full of resting diesels, scattered in new sheds around the yard, along with a completely new track layout. It was unsettling. Moralaev was soon brought along the new set of tracks to the only yard she had seen before. The smelter's yard. Looking back to the diesel, Moralaev noticed one of his eyes remained half closed throughout their journey, and found that this looked familiar. Then it came to her. The exact same look her sister, Sorka Craig, had in her eye while she was alive. The rusted engine's sister had been very sickly all throughout her life, and was partially blind in one eye because of it. This caused her appearance to be rather odd-looking. This diesel had her sister's look in his eye, a look that brought back memories. She worked alongside Moralaev in the slate mines all her life before crashing, which only worsened her sight and look more. Sorka Craig took a while to adjust to her condition, but kept a positive attitude even during her hardest days. Moralaev had always admired her for this, though she also grew nervous for her sister's safety as her reliability lessened. She would often end up staying awake all night, trying to come up with a solution, to no avail. One night in January, 8 Januaries before the present night, Moralaev was ordered to visit the works, and saw Sorka Craig positioned atop a flatbed, her smile drained from her face. Hardly stable enough to look in her eyes, her sister somberly told her that she was being scrapped that day, More Alive teared up, desperately trying to deny it, before her sister hushed her. Don't worry. You will be able to rest now, Sorka Craig told her sister, with tears in her eyes as she was brought by another engine into the smelter's shed. More Alive barged in behind the engine and stared dumbfounded at Sorka Craig, who yelled, "Goodbye, my sister!" with her eyes watering as she disappeared into the flame. She never truly got over that day, but now it was her turn, and her very own sister, reincarnated and strong, was to put her to rest, just as the opposite was 9 years before. She'd already started tearing up in her mind from grief and joy all at once, and the same went for Sinead, who, despite not knowing their exact connection, felt very sad to see her go, and yet was relieved to know she'd suffer no more in this life. More Alive was gripped by a crane and lifted above the furnace. With bittersweet tears in his eyes, Sinead saw a flickering image of her youthful, undamaged face within the sparks, and said, "Goodbye, my More Alive," while through the sparks surrounding, the faint shape of Sorka Craig glistened within the shape of Sinead. Her soul glanced at her with tears before she responded, "Goodbye, my sister," within her mind and heart, which echoed throughout the world until More Alive was no more. Stepney was cold and alone, along with his crew. He had been on loan for a whole week and was finally returning to his home. He was told he could make it there through the night, which he saw no problem in. He had had several nighttime runs, and in some ways preferred them to the daytime ones. They were more peaceful, and he enjoyed travelling under the moonlight. On this night, however, no one mentioned the fog. It was very thick too, and Stepney's lamp didn't make much of a difference. He had no idea how far he was from home, but more importantly, he didn't know where he was right now. He had hoped he would, as he was sure he was taking the same route he had used to where he was loaned. Surely this must be the same one. As he continued on, he noticed something in the distance, a bright red glow. Stepney knew what it was.
"Hey, look, it's a signal,"
he called to his crew.
Ah, maybe we can ask the signalman where we are.
The driver put on the brakes, and the little engine came to a gentle stop, next to the signal. Once they were close enough, they could also make out the signal box. The signalman spotted them too, and walked towards the door.
Looks like the signalman wants to see us.
Rather him than us. Your fire's so warm, I don't want to leave it.
driver, I don't think we took this route before.
Really? Why's that?
Because I don't remember seeing that.
The driver and fireman looked at what Stepney was referring to. There was a set of buildings that looked as if they hadn't been touched for decades. They could also see several sidings that had rusty, overgrown track, and among all of this was a lonely single-row shed that, much like the other buildings, had seen better days. Stepney wasn't sure if he was scared or intrigued. What is this place? He turned back to the signalman that had just stopped in front of them.
Evening, you lot. Haven't exactly picked the best night for a run, have you?
No one told us about the fog. I thought it would be a clear night.
Well, that's the weather for you. The bastards will say you're gonna get a lovely day, but it ends up being miserable. Anyway, where are you heading?
Brighton.
Brighton? Then why are you taking this route? It's the longest one there.
Well, that's the thing. We don't really recognise this route. We didn't take it before. How far is Brighton from here?
Honestly, I don't know the exact distance. Regardless, I don't recommend reaching it tonight, lads. This fog's getting worse by every minute, and it isn't safe.
Stepney groaned. This was the last thing he wanted to hear.
But where can we stay? I don't want to stay out here. It's dark and miserable.
Well, you can stay in that shed over there by the mines. It's not pretty, but it'll have to do.
Oh, so that's what that place is.
No idea how long it's been there. I took control of this box 8 years ago.
The signalman paused. He looked at all the buildings from one to another. He seemed to be deep in thought.
I've heard stories about this place, when it was being operated and some of its incidents.
What kind of stories?
Well, let's just say some of them are rather unpleasant. I always hear noises from there too, as if there's still people in the mines. But I know that's impossible. All the mines have collapsed. No one can fit in there now. Could have just been in my head.
He then turned to the crew in the cab.
As for you two, you're welcome to stay in the box as long as you don't create any distractions.
Of course. Thank you.
Stepney slowly backed down into the shed. The wooden walls were all rotten and dirty, and there were holes in the roof. However, he realised it was either the shed or staying on a siding in the cold temperature and mist. But that wasn't the only thing on Stepney's mind.
What do you think that signalman was talking about?
The crew had put out his fire, and they walked round to the front of him.
Not sure. If you ask me, he sounds a bit crazy. Can't say I'm surprised when he spends almost every day in that little box.
Oi! Enough of that! That signalman you call crazy was kind enough to give us a shelter for the night. Unless, of course, you want to sleep outside.
Oh, God, no! Can't stand another second out here. Sorry, Stepney. Wish you had better shelter than this.
Yes, well, I guess it'll have to do. I'll be fine. East Grinstead's been worse than this, long ago.
Make sure you get loads of rest, old boy. We've still got a way to go tomorrow.
I'll try. Oh, good night, you two.
Good night, Stepney.
Good night, Stepney.
And with that, the driver and fireman walked away towards the signal box. And now, Stepney was truly alone. He couldn't see very far in front of him. The mist made it feel like he was on a very small pocket of land, completely separated from the rest of the world. And there was no one. No one besides him. Stepney wasn't sure if he would ever get sleep, but gradually he felt more and more tired. Finally, He closed his eyes and sleep took over.
Hello? Is anyone there?
Stepney didn't know how long he was asleep. When he opened his eyes, everything was the same. He was still at the old mine, still in the old dirty shed. What was different was the mist. It was even thicker now, and the area around him felt even smaller. Of course, though, that wasn't what woke him. Stepney surveyed all the deserted buildings, but he couldn't see anyone. But if there's no one, who did he hear?
Hello? Can anyone hear me?
The voice had an echo to it, as if it was coming from a cave. That could only mean one thing. Stepney looked towards the mine entrances that he could just make out through the blanket of fog.
Wait, someone is in there. Help! Someone please help!
Stepney began to feel uneasy. That wasn't the same voice as before. Was there two people in there?
Is anyone there? I'm trapped.
Another one. How many were in there? Snapping out of his confusion, Stepney realized that the logical thing to do was to call back. So whoever was in there would know they would have been heard and would be freed. Stepney could only imagine how terrible it would be to be trapped inside a mine with no way out and no light to help them see. He would feel like a monster if he just stood by and did nothing. He opened his mouth to speak, but then he closed it. Stepney realized he had forgotten something. Something that the signalman had said.
All the mines have collapsed. No one can fit in there now.
Stepney wasn't just confused, but now he was scared. Was the signalman telling the truth? Did he mean every single mine shaft? If he did, no one should be in there. No one could be in there.
Hello?
At that point, more cries can be heard, several voices now, all of them expressing nothing but complete fear and horror, and all Stepney could do was sit motionless and listen. He then made a decision. Whether it was impossible for them to be in there or not, he knew better than to ignore them. He opened his mouth to try and call out again. However, he was interrupted again, but not because of his thoughts. The voices were now not the only sounds he could hear. Now, he could make out the sounds of rocks crumbling within the mines, as if there was a large, deadly stampede. The calls for help were now replaced with crying and screaming. Any chances of saving whoever was in there had faded away. Stepney felt like crying. His fire was out, he couldn't see the signal box his crew was in, and the sounds of screaming showed no signs of ending. Then, without warning, there was silence. There was no more screaming, no more rocks crumbling, just silence. Stepney couldn't pull himself out of the shock he was in. Despite all he heard, it didn't add up. If the mines were buried, as the signalman said, then no one could be in there. But someone was in there. The thought of sleep never crossed Stepney's mind. He had just witnessed something terrifying. Something that shouldn't be possible. How could he sleep after that? As the night wore on, though, he felt more and more exhausted, and once again he closed his eyes and drifted into slumber. When Stepney opened his eyes, it was daytime and the fog had lifted. He looked in front of him and saw his driver, fireman, and the signalman walking towards him.
Morning, Stepney. How was your night?
Oh, am I glad to see you?
The crew were confused. They then looked closely at their engine and realized he was very pale.
Stepney? What's the matter? Are you okay?
I heard something last night. There were noises. Noises coming from the mine.
What? Are you serious?
I wish I wasn't.
Were they the sounds of people crying for help?
All eyes immediately fixated on the signalman, and Stepney began to shiver.
Yes. How did...
Wait, what are you talking about? You know something about this too.
I've heard stories like that in the mines before. Already told you that last night.
But you said they were in your head.
I said they could have just been in my head, but after what Stepney just said, I wish they were.
There was a long silence. No one knew what to say. At last, the silence was broken by Stepney.
You said you heard stories about this mine. Stories that were unpleasant. What are they? Do they have something to do with what I heard last night?
The signalman didn't respond for a moment, but then slowly nodded his head.
From what I've been told, these mines were operated in the early 20th century. It only lasted 7 years. The reason why? It was known as one of the most dangerous places in Britain.
Well, industries like this were usually dangerous back then, I should know.
As an engine from the 19th century, Stepney had witnessed the growth and change of railways and industry throughout the last several decades. Not just in technology, but also the importance of safety. Nowadays, safety is regarded as a top priority, unlike back then.
Yeah, but anyone who's worked there got the worst of it. The equipment was rarely well maintained and most of it was out of date. That sort of thing led to accidents. Well, I say accidents, but if the people in charge did their job and make sure the place was in proper working condition, it would have lasted longer. It was believed that the managers didn't give a damn about their workers. They were all expendable in their eyes. So, I always saw those accidents as murders.
Stepney and his crew went pale after hearing that.
Those who were in the mine, however, suffered the most. The wooden shafts holding them up were weak and rotten. No one had ever considered replacing them. That resulted in several collapses that occurred over those 7 years, leaving many miners trapped. At least when it came to with those with the equipment, their deaths were most quick and painless. But those in the mines, their pain was almost endless. They had no light, no food, and sometimes no air. They could do nothing except for cry for help, hoping it would come. It rarely did. The voices you heard last night, Stepney, were those men who were sadly unlucky.
Stepney was horrified. He now wished he didn't ask for this, but it was too late now.
I knew one of those lucky few. He was only at the mine for a year, but one time being trapped was too much. Once he was freed, he resigned and exposed the careless management. That was in 1909, the same year the mine closed. As for this person, let's just say if this man didn't survive, I wouldn't be here right now.
What are you talking about?
That man was my father. He got a new job as a shopkeeper, and I was born 2 years after he left the mine. He told me all this when I was a teenager, and well, my reaction was the same as yours. When I became the signalman and was assigned to this box, at first I was scared, but when I think about it, it felt right for me to be here, to keep those lonely miners some company. As the son of one of their colleagues, even though I can't help them, and I have to listen to them suffer almost every single night.
The signalman sighed and looked back at the crew and Stepney.
I called ahead, and there aren't any trains scheduled to come down this route. so you have a clear path. Sorry I scared you.
It's fine.
Stepney said quietly. In truth, he wasn't scared anymore, but felt sad. The crew entered the cab, and the little engine puffed away. It was early in the afternoon when Stepney finally returned to Brighton. Several engines passed him, whistling hello. He whistled back, but his peeps were short and quiet. The shed was mostly empty, save for a few engines. Without saying a word, Stepney went to the very back of the shed. He saw no point in telling them about what had happened. He was sure they wouldn't believe it and laugh at him. That was the last thing he needed. He closed his eyes, and this time, nothing horrifying disturbed him. Stepney never went past the old mine again. He never had the chance, as a year later he was withdrawn from service and taken to a scrapyard. He wasn't there for long though, as he was restored and purchased by the Bluebell Railway, where, aside from a few visits to other railways, he has remained ever since. He did eventually learn that the route he had taken on that night was ripped up due to the lack of any important traffic. However, he never learned of what became of the signalman. Naturally, he lost his job there, but what about afterwards? Did he get a new job? Perhaps he was assigned to another box. He didn't know, and he never would. As time went on, Stepney thought less about the old mine. What he encountered there didn't seem to matter anymore. The line that went past it was now gone, and it was a place that the world would soon forget. Sometimes though, when he's asleep, Stepney is sure he can hear voices. Voices of the miners, calling and crying for help that they will never get.